Marley was dead to begin with. There was no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon anything he chose to put his hand to. So yes, Marley was dead. In fact, some might go so far to say that old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Yet, to say this would be to completely miss the point. For a doornail, as any schoolchild will tell you, has never been alive, unlike a flesh and blood creature like, say, old Marley. It simply isn't a like-for-like case in this regard, and so I must press this point upon you that no, Marley was not as dead as a doornail. Nor indeed was he as dead as many dead people. Marley's body was dead. Of course it was. Even at the moment of the opening of our narrative, the body of Marley was mouldering quite happily away in his grave. But Marley himself, or perhaps I should say Marley's spirit, had been doomed to walk the earth. He had attended his own deathbed, the reading of his own will, the distribution of his worldly chattels, and his own funeral. The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from, that there's no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I am going to relate. Death had changed him, although not as much in appearance as you might expect. In his pigtail, waistcoat, tights, boots and coat skirts, he looked utterly the man he had been in life. Nor was it the terrible chain, the chain that wrapped around his body, that chain that we shall and must come back to. No, Marley had changed because of the things he'd seen. You see, those who are condemned to walk the earth are afforded two most terrible of gifts: time to observe the workings of the world and an inability to do anything about the horrors they see. Because of this, he had become a twisted wreck of the man he'd once been. A tormented, powerless, agonized, grief-stricken, suffering, sorrowful, desolated old sinner. The guilt he felt chilled him until he was as cold as iron. It deadened the ruddiness of his living features, iced his stare, gnarled his hands, and chilled the breath in his throat. He kept to the shadows during the day, as sunlight had an agonizing effect on his cold form, like hot water onto frostbite. And he was solitary in his grief. For even though London was as polluted with shades of the dead as it was with rats, each of these spirits was so wrapped up in its own torment as to make them as remote as an iceberg. No spectre ever stopped him in the street to say, "My dear Marley, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No ghouls implored him to bestow a penny. No banshee asked him what it was o'clock. Of the living, only the blind men's dogs appeared to know him. And when they saw him coming, they would tug their masters into doorways and up courts. There they would wag their tails as though they were saying, "Walk on, dark master. There's no comfort for you here." And through all of this, he was compelled to walk. During the day, he kept to the shadowy streets to avoid the furnace glare of the sun. Unfortunately, this confined him to the places of the worst degradation, where he was forced to bear the witness to the lives of the poor, some of whom might have been known to him in life. That is, if he'd ever taken time to put a face to a name. Names that were kept in the ledger of the firm of Scrooge and Marley. Scrooge and Marley, as the old firm was still known to one and all, for Scrooge had never painted out Marley's name upon the sign. There it stood, above the warehouse door, evidence of Jacob Marley's complicity in this uncaring little enterprise. Sometimes Marley wondered if this was the last fetter that bound him to the earth. But in his ghostly heart, he knew it was the chains that kept him where he was. The chains that he had forged in life. Each link, a life he'd bound up in a stultifying contract. Each cash box, a deal that disregarded his fellow man. And each lock, a soul he'd turned out of his own home for the want of a farthing. It was the chain he hated most of all. Once upon a time, on all of the good days of the year on Christmas Eve, Marley was walking towards his old counting house with the dreaded chains dragging behind him. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was already quite dark. It had not been light all day. The people in the street were wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts, stamping their feet on the pavement to keep warm. Marley hated touching the living to any degree. They had such an annoying habit of walking through one if you did not keep your wits about you. He attempted to keep out of people's way, but found this almost impossible, as, this being the day before Christmas, the streets were more than usually full. As he approached the window of Scrooge and Marley's, he observed the small fire in Scrooge's office. Smaller than there would have been in Marley's day. It was just one coal and some hope on a bed of ashes. Marley watched the clerk. He could not for the life of him remember the fellow's name. The clerk shivered and attempted to stop his pen from shaking. He was so intent on observing the poor man's endeavours to keep warm that he had no time to notice the other fellow that bowled along the street towards him. Now, one could not, even in the dense winter fog, have mistaken this man for a wraith. He was all in a glow, his face ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkling with a very spirit of man. He walked with a purpose and such palpable goodwill that people on the street who didn't know him cheerfully greeted his cries of "Season's greetings" with felicitations of their own. With boundless spirit, the man strode up to Scrooge's front door and, without a pause for Marley's feelings, reached clean through Marley's stomach, turned the handle on the office door with a booming "Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" as he passed through the shade of Jacob Marley. The man's voice rang in Marley's ears. Now, you cannot imagine how loud a person sounds when they're speaking whilst passing through the interior of your head. It dazed Marley so much that he hardly realised that he had started to drift. Now, it's a fact that ghosts, though they may appear to be insubstantial, do have some little form and weight. Very little form, even less weight to be sure. But it had been calculated by people much more learned than myself that the average soul weighs in just under 3/4 of an ounce. This is made up of everything that made a person that could not be accounted for as body. This deficit in the ledger takes up the same space that the body did in life. This is how ghosts can be observed to pass through things, or indeed to let things like vigorous young gentlemen pass through them. In usual circumstances, this not the bodiness can reorder itself to allow such a passage. Unfortunately, if they're not prepared for such an event, they can drift. That's to say, because they have not much weight, once this form is unwittingly sent in motion, they can find it hard to stop. With no more control over his movements than a piece of thistledown in the wind, Marley drifted, first towards the entrance, and then, as the energetic young gentleman heartily slammed the door back in its frame, out he was propelled into the thronging street and straight into the traffic.